To understand Dragon Ball's greatest narrative weaknesses, you have to look past the hype, the transformations, the iconic fights, the moments that defined entire generations. Because, on the surface, everything works. The stakes feel high, the battles feel intense, and the story keeps pushing forward. But when you step back and look at the structure beneath it all, certain patterns start to appear. Patterns that repeat across arcs, across series, and even across decades. And these patterns aren't just small flaws. They're fundamental weaknesses in how the story is built. Weaknesses that don't always break Dragon Ball, but quietly shape the way its narrative evolves, for better and for worse. One of Dragon Ball's most consistent narrative patterns is simple. Every new villain has to be stronger than the last. On the surface, that sounds like natural progression. Higher stakes, bigger threats, more intense battles. But over time, this constant escalation starts to create a problem. When strength becomes the only way to raise tension, the story begins to lose variety. Conflicts become predictable, because instead of asking how the heroes will win, the question becomes how much stronger they need to get. You can see this clearly across the series, from Frieza to Cell to Buu, and later into Dragon Ball Super with Jiren and beyond. Each villain exists primarily to surpass the previous one, forcing the heroes into new transformations or higher levels of power just to keep up. Strategy, creativity, and unique abilities take a back seat, replaced by a straightforward formula: bigger threat, bigger power. And while this creates hype, it also reduces tension, because the outcome starts to feel inevitable: another victory through raw strength. There are exceptions that show how this formula could be more interesting. The jump from Jiren to Broly is one of them. Broly isn't simply introduced as a stronger version of Jiren. Instead, the conflict shifts toward control, chaos, and unpredictability. It's even implied that Ultra Instinct Goku could have been enough to deal with Jiren. But because Goku couldn't access it against Broly, the solution wasn't just get stronger, it was strategy, leading to fusion. That shift makes the fight feel different. Not because Broly is definitively above everything before him, but because the approach to defeating him changes. And that's exactly what Dragon Ball often misses. When power escalation becomes the default, it limits storytelling. Villains stop being defined by their ideas, abilities, or impact on the world, and instead become markers on a scale of strength. The result is a cycle where each arc has to go bigger than the last, not because the story demands it, but because the structure expects it. And over time, that cycle doesn't just raise the ceiling, it narrows the path the story can take. If power escalation is one of Dragon Ball's structural weaknesses, then wasted potential is its most frustrating one. Because unlike power levels, this isn't about what the story can't do, it's about what it chooses not to do. Dragon Ball constantly introduces ideas, characters, and narrative setups with incredible promise, only to leave them underdeveloped or unresolved. The clearest example of this is Gohan. From the very beginning, the story builds him up as someone with hidden power capable of surpassing everyone else. His moments against Raditz, Vegeta, and especially Cell all reinforce this idea, culminating in a complete payoff during the Cell saga. But instead of fully committing to that direction, the series pulls back, repeatedly reminding us of his potential without ever consistently exploring it. Even in later arcs, with forms like Beast Gohan, the narrative still treats his strength as something that could go further, keeping him in a constant state of almost. And it's not just Gohan. Characters like Piccolo, Tien, and even Goten and Trunks are introduced with unique abilities, perspectives, or narrative roles. Yet they gradually fade into the background. The story sets them up to matter, to evolve, to contribute in meaningful ways, but rarely follows through. This creates a kind of narrative imbalance, where ideas are introduced faster than they are resolved, leaving behind a trail of unfinished potential. The real issue isn't that every character needs to be fully explored, it's that Dragon Ball repeatedly signals importance without delivering on it. It places these narrative promises in front of the audience, builds anticipation around them, and then shifts focus before they can truly pay off. And over time, that pattern weakens the story. Because potential without payoff doesn't just feel incomplete, it makes the world feel smaller, as if only a select few ideas are ever allowed to fully matter. Death, in most stories, is the ultimate source of tension. It represents consequence, sacrifice, and finality. But in Dragon Ball, death gradually loses that meaning. Early in the series, it carried real weight when characters died, it felt permanent. Goku's sacrifice against Raditz or Krillin's death at the hands of Frieza weren't just plot points, they were defining moments. However, as the series progresses, the existence of the Dragon Balls begins to undermine that tension. Death becomes less of an ending and more of a temporary setback, something that can almost always be reversed with the right conditions. While this mechanic is central to the world, its overuse reduces the stakes of major conflicts. When the audience knows that most losses can be undone, the emotional impact of those moments starts to fade. Sacrifice feels less permanent, danger feels less threatening, and the sense of risk becomes harder to maintain. This doesn't mean Dragon Ball loses its core, but it relies on other elements' spectacle and power to create tension. The problem is that without meaningful consequences, those elements can only carry so much weight. Over time, the story begins to feel safer, less willing to commit to irreversible outcomes that could truly challenge its characters. As Dragon Ball evolves, its focus narrows more and more around two central characters, Goku and Vegeta. While their rivalry is one of the strongest aspects, this increasing focus comes at a cost to the wider cast. Characters like Piccolo, Tien, and Krillin often find themselves sidelined, reduced to spectators in conflicts. Earlier arcs thrived on variety, with different fighters contributing through strategy, teamwork, or unique abilities. But as the story centers on Goku and Vegeta, that diversity fades. Conflicts become more straightforward, resolved primarily by these two. The result is a narrative that feels smaller, despite its increasingly larger scale and the introduction of new universes. Transformations are iconic. They create memorable moments, turning battles into emotional climaxes. But over time, the series has become increasingly dependent on them as solutions rather than rare, meaningful breakthroughs. Earlier moments, like the first Super Saiyan, worked because they were built on emotion, struggle, and story progression. They felt earned. But as more forms are introduced, the focus shifts to simply what it looks like and how strong it is. Instead of solving problems through strategy, the story leans on new transformations to push past obstacles. While this keeps the pace fast and the visuals exciting, it limits the narrative depth. Transformations flaws, expected Dragon Ball continues to thrive in. That's because its strengths are powerful enough to mask its weaknesses. At its core, the series excels at creating memorable characters, high-energy battles, and moments of pure hype that resonate with audiences across generations. Goku's optimism, Vegeta's pride, and their evolving dynamic provide a strong emotional foundation that keeps viewers invested, even when the storytelling structure shows cracks. Dragon Ball also benefits from its simplicity. Its core themes growth, perseverance, and surpassing limits are easy to understand and universally appealing. This allows the series to deliver impactful moments without needing overly complex narratives. When everything aligns, a transformation with emotional weight, a rivalry reaching its peak, or a sacrifice that truly matters, Dragon Ball reminds us why it became so iconic in the first place. And that's why these weaknesses often go unnoticed or uncriticized. The series is so good at delivering spectacle and emotional highs that it distracts from the underlying patterns. Fans remember the moments, the first Super Saiyan, the final Kamehameha, the intensity of a climactic battle, more than the structure that led to them. Dragon Ball doesn't succeed because it's flawless. It succeeds because, at its best, it knows exactly how to make those flaws feel invisible. At the end of the day, Dragon Ball's narrative weaknesses don't erase what makes it great, but they do shape what it could become. Because these patterns power escalation, wasted potential, low stakes, over-reliance on transformations. And a narrowed focus don't just affect individual arcs. They define the limits of the story itself. They determine how far the narrative can evolve before it starts repeating itself, and that's why they matter. Not because Dragon Ball is failing, but because it has always had the potential to be more. The series has already shown glimpses of deeper storytelling moments where character, strategy, and emotion take priority over raw power. Moments where fights aren't just about who's stronger, but about what's at stake and why it matters. Those moments prove that Dragon Ball doesn't need to rely on its habitual patterns to succeed, just often chooses to. Looking forward, the future of Dragon Ball depends on whether it's willing to evolve to let more characters matter, to create conflicts that aren't solved by the next transformation, to introduce consequences that truly change the world, and the people in it. Because the foundation is already there. The characters, the themes, the legacy. Dragon Ball doesn't need to reinvent itself. It just needs to push its storytelling the same way its characters push their limits.